Ladies and gentlemen, we are glad to be back together this week after a week off. I hope some of you guys maybe braved some of the rain for Makers Fest this past week. But we're glad to be back here in our home at the two Mississippi Museums, in the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History, and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. As always, we are streaming live on Facebook and YouTube, where all of those past videos are available to watch at any time. I hope you'll consider joining us this Sunday for Sunday Screening, Mississippi History Day Student Showcase. Again, this Sunday, May 18th at 2 p.m. right here in the Craig Neilsen Auditorium. These award-winning student documentaries received glowing reviews 2 years ago at the National History Day competition in Washington, D.C. in 2023. National History Day is a cross-curricular project-based learning program that encourages middle school and high school students to develop creative, original historical research based on an annual theme. And so we're really excited. Both of these films, one of them was screened at NAMAC, the National African American Museum of History and Culture, and the other one won 8th place internationally. And so we are very proud of these student filmmakers, and we're glad to have them with us this Sunday. So I hope you'll join us for that. We also hope that you'll come back next week, May 21st, where we'll have Mississippi Civil Rights veteran MacArthur Cotton present his latest book, Mississippi's Black Cotton. But today we are excited to welcome Lawrence Strout, who's a tenured associate professor at Mississippi State University. He earned his PhD in communication with an emphasis in media history from Florida State University. He has published numerous scholarly works and is the author of Covering McCarthyism: How the Christian Science Monitor Covered McCarthyism, 1950 through 1954, as well as Past Christian and the Gazebo Gazette, a Gulf Community's Post-Katrina Triumph, which is the topic for today's presentation. Before entering academia in 1990, Strout worked in commercial and public broadcasting for 14 years. Dr. Strout lives with his wife Penny in Past Christian, and we are pleased to welcome Dr. Lawrence Strout with us today.
All right, glad to see you here, and we're going to start out going into a little bit about the storm, because you don't have the newspaper actually without the storm. So we're going to start and look at that. Get right into it, and all of a sudden the clicker, hold on, I'll have to do it here. Nope, it's something is, there it is. Thank you. All right, so this is the cover, and something's going to be really serious, you ought to take it serious. And if he doesn't think it's going to be, he'll tell you that. So, okay, let's see what Bob Breck has to say. If you are Let's load up the minivan. Yeah, I mean, that's some serious business there. So we said, okay, let's get out of here. And of course, it's a good thing we did. This information is a statement from Noah prior to the storm. And so making sure everybody heeds the warning. And not everyone did, as you can well imagine. So this was a very large storm, very large. And it wasn't so much, as you know, the winds that caused the damage. The winds, they were bad, but I mean, it was the surge because of how large the storm was. So very large storm hitting there and making landfall. Okay, so yeah, Pascagoula's mayor, Chipper McDermott, said the Hurricane Katrina took the city from the 21st century to the 18th century in 24 hours, which is pretty accurate. Just everything destroyed, kind of, you have to start over. You start over, and instead of starting over on pristine land, you're starting over in what looks like a dump. I mean, it's just debris everywhere. This is a typical street. Yeah, that's the street, okay? And you can see, because you can see the power poles. And this is not long after the storm, and virtually every street was like this. So it wasn't until they got the bulldozers in, and that's what they did initially, to clear some paths so people could get around. But most of the streets, this is what it was like. It's just debris everywhere. This was City Hall. City Hall is not far from the beach there, and you can see it basically got wiped out. Now, some of the structure was there. It wasn't structurally sound, though, after the storm. It's just, but you can see it's City Hall. And this became City Hall, and it's funny, not for a year or 2 years or what, years and years, all right? It took years and years to build back. So a lot of offices, both city offices and professional. I know my vet was in a trailer for, I don't know how many years, I think almost a decade, because she had to get everything together to build back. But this became City Hall for, I think it was a little over 5 years. Now, I told you about North Street. This is North Street, pretty far in. This house basically floated all the way and then landed in the Shell station, okay? So if you're that heavy a house and floating, the water has to be pretty high and flowing pretty heavily there. So that was, I think, a good shot. Quite a ways away from the beach, but nevertheless not away from the effect of the surge. This is the Trinity Episcopal Church. Has a long history of being in Pascagoula and been destroyed a number of times, a number of different hurricanes. But whoever framed this did a fine job because it did survive, and they did rebuild on that frame. So That was amazing because most everything was flattened, including just down the street an old post office that you'd never think was brick and so forth. That was just gone, you know, but the Trinity Episcopal did survive. Now, this is a one of a kind. This is the Catholic Church. All right, you say, well, really? Haven't seen a Catholic church like that. No, you haven't. So one of a kind. What happened after Camille, my father-in-law and some of the other parishioners got together and they said, well, we don't want to, we don't want to lose another church. What do we do to build a church that's going to withstand a hurricane? And my father-in-law says, I can build one. It's not going to look like a church, but we can build one. And that's what they built, this A-frame. And it did survive. Now, obviously, the water went through it. And so they eventually decided to tear it down. But he said, the wind of surge will not knock this down, no matter what it is. And he was right in that sense. So, but it was a unique church. My wife, despite her father having a great deal to do with the design, just hated that because she likes the old, ornate Catholic churches. They replaced it in the corner of the lot with this, okay? This is the new one they built. Now, there's a big lot where the old church was over here, and they have sold that. I think that it's going to be condominiums there, all right? But that's a cute little church there. This is what school kids faced in Post-Katrina for quite a while, the portable classrooms. And again, they were put up wherever they, had the land to do it. This was north quite a ways. But, and again, it was quite a while that they went in these so-called temporary portable classrooms. This is sad. Camille, that's right, I'm saying Camille killed a lot of people in Katrina, okay? And these are two elderly couple whose home survived Camille. And if you lived through Camille and ever met anybody that lived through Camille, they were convinced, never going to get anything worse than Camille. Okay, not going to happen. Well, the Langs who lived here stayed and they didn't survive. So it was, and there were a number of people like that who said, well, this survived Camille, this survived anything. Well, it wasn't. Very, very sad. But that's the Langs steps there. Here you have Malcolm Jones. Now, the mayor of Post-Katrina, I think the best way to describe it is, I think he had PTSD. He could not function. He could not function. So the city attorney, Malcolm Jones, stepped up. Big time. I mean, did all the things that a working mayor should do and more. And so he's sort of, if you read in the book, he's one of the heroes of this because, it isn't something he's obligated to do. He's city attorney. He's not elected, not anything. But he took it among himself to do what he could to help out the city. And you can see there's some senators here from U.S. senators that were visiting the area. This is my house, all right? And this is after Katrina, after we rebuilt. But if you look right here, okay, that's the steps there, on top of the steps. That's 17 feet 6 inches above sea level, right? 17, so that floor, the floor basically, 17 feet 6 inches above sea level. So what did this house look like at the peak of surge? That's what it looked like. The only thing, we had a bonus room that we had an old TV, and things in the attic were okay. The rest, as you can see, flooded. Okay. and we have rebuilt, but it's just if you're out there and you look at this house up, you can't imagine that it had that much water there, but it did, and we had the water lines to prove it in there. All right, so we're happy we rebuilt. All right, so let's get a little bit of a history here related to media. Now, for years and years, over a century, Post-Katrina was served by a paper. And the latest, it was called the Tarpon Beacon, but originally it was the Coast Beacon. And again, started 1880. But as, other media took over and so forth, the last issue of the Tarpon Beacon was in October of 1990. So they didn't have a newspaper after that. So they relied on, a number of other sources, which we'll get to as we go along here. So no Tarpon Beacon. The storm hits. Post-Katrina is covered by the Sun Herald and WLOX. Now, the Sun Herald won a Pulitzer for its coverage. I believe WLOX won an Edward R. Murrow Award. Those are the highest awards you can get, and they did a great job. But Post-Katrina was off to the side. Mostly they're reporting on Gulfport and Biloxi and Pascagoula and all of those things, and little details that homeowners need to know in Post-Katrina. You're not going to get it there. They're trying to, cover this wide area and do the best they can. And they did a great job, but they're not going to give you details of things that you need as a homeowner in Post-Katrina. And that's basically what it's saying there. So and the past was really isolated. Give you how isolated. The Red Cross never made it to Post-Katrina. The Red Cross, you may know, they have to set priorities. They can't help everybody. And so they went to the population areas. And, and they were helping as many people as did a great job. I'm not criticizing them. But we were so isolated and so few people there, they didn't even show up there. So we're isolated. The only ways we could get information, and I remember it well, was a weekly alderman meeting at the East End Fire Station that had been flooded, but the structure survived. So we'd gather there at noontime once a week to find out what's going on in the city. Now, I was a professor at Xavier in New Orleans at the time, and we were going to be out at least till January because they had to rebuild the campus and stuff. So I could go to these meetings, but a lot of people, they're going to work somewhere. They can't, take off and find out what's going on at these meetings. And then there was a really wonderful food tent, right near Trinity Episcopal Church, that shell we showed you there. And that was a place where you went there and, oh, wow, so I remember my wife was raised in Post-Katrina, so she knows a lot of people there. And she'd go to that, oh, good, how was your house and all, And she even a few times, we were wondering, we hadn't heard from certain people, and they showed up, it's like, oh, good, they're safe. You didn't want to think the worst, but you're wondering, well, what's going on with them. So the food tent was tremendous. But again, it's word of mouth. And of course, the alderman's meeting, not everybody can make it to that, of course. But those are the two ways to get information. And again, if you're a homeowner, the info you need to know to decide whether to go back to town or not, to rebuild or not, and all the different things that you need, the information you need to make informed decisions. All right, so this is Evelina Schmuckler. She was a freelance journalist, and she was living in Atlanta, and she's, between freelance. I think she'd been in the Middle East for the Wall Street Journal, she's kind of a big-time reporter in that sense. She reported on some really important things. But she said, well, I'm not doing anything. I'm going to try to help. So she loaded up supplies and went to the coast, volunteers there, and then traveled back to Atlanta. Well, lo and behold, the day after Christmas, remember, of course, Katrina was the end of August. So the day after Christmas, she returns with a group of friends. And while volunteering, Schmuckler and friends stayed in a mobile home donated to the Pas-Christian Library, okay? And she stayed there courtesy of the librarian, Sally James. Everybody in Pas-Christian knows Sally James, and because there were no books there, but we had, a working volunteer, she offered the mobile home for some volunteers to stay. But it also prompted an idea about what the problems we had and how we could solve at least one of the problems. She mentioned to Schmuckler that the lack of communication within the community was hampering volunteer efforts and the coordination of the city's rebuilding. Up until this point, AmeriCorps volunteers had periodically distributed a 1 or 2 page kind of newsletter kind of thing, a bulleted list of different items, and a phone list if you've got problems and so forth. But that something needed to be consistent and cover all the things that need to be covered, again, so citizens can decide whether to come back or not, and then once they've decided to come back, can guide them through rebuilding and the like. And this is Evelina with the paper here, some years later. So, they were the founders of the paper, and the first one is January of 2006, all right? And well, of course, she was a volunteer and so forth, and she ended up the editor-in-chief of this. But I wanted to, it morphed into a commercial enterprise, okay. So, I'm trying to get, how do you name a newspaper, right? They create a newspaper, but they want to name the newspaper, and they want it to be accurate, representing the town and circumstances. Well, Schmuckler looked at this, and she thought there were a lot of very generic names, and she didn't want to do that. She wanted something less common. And she thought of Gazette, and then she also thought, well, it sounds like the Russian word Gazeta. And since she was born in Ukraine when it was part of the Soviet Union, all right? Soviet Union is trying to make it part of them again now, but that's a whole nother seminar. So she thought, wow, that would put her kind of stamp on it. We use Gazette, and it'll work with that. So she comes up with a prototype. So this is a prototype, Pas-Christian Gazette. And again, this is early January. A lot of different stories. I'm going to point out one here. FEMA rep reported 272 building permits had been processed. There are 50 in queue. Also said processed 10 out of 25 appeals from law. You say, well, what is that about? We had gone months. And again, the person who issued building permits in Pas-Christian, PTSD. Basically paralyzed, not issuing them. I mean, and so somehow I think FEMA kind of took over at the request of the city, because we had to get these permits. You can't rebuild the city without permits. So they did, and that was a big deal. My wife and I were one of the first ones to get a building permit. I don't know why that was, but we were ready to build, and our contractor went and did everything he needed to do, and we started building our house a lot sooner than a lot of people. But that building permit's very important, because everybody had heard nobody's getting a building permit. So telling people through the newspaper, they know what's going on. So that's the prototype. So that isn't the name of the paper, all right? So what happens here? Well, in an email Schmuckler sent to an alderman who she was working with. You know, he had told her the need for the paper too and so forth, kind of a joint kind of effort. Again, it's labeled Post-Katrina Gazette. Piernes thought the prototype looked great, but suggested that perhaps the Post-Katrina Gazebo would be better than the Gazette, because the gazebo in War Memorial Park was a symbol of the city and appeared on business cards and stationery and so forth. Now this is the new one, the new gazebo, but it looks exactly like the old one, and it does. It is a signature of the city. So she looks at that and goes, "Wait a minute, I think I can solve this." Simple solution. Gazebo Gazette would appear in the large, bold print on the front page, nameplate, and above it, in smaller bold letters, Post-Katrina would be written. And so this is the first issue of the Gazebo Gazette. And it was handed out, it was free. You can see most of this, again, this is January. I remember the storm hit the end of August. Most of the story is about clearing the streets, demolishing buildings that are dangerous. They're still at that point where it's just a mess. It's a dump, believe me. We lived in it because we rebuilt our house and we got in by March, which was early. And we didn't go out of the house because we did not want to see how we were living in the middle of a dump. I mean, it was just, it was pretty horrendous there. So you've got a lot of things there about demolishing homes, a baseball park that they're going to set aside for some things, and local contractors being given priority because people were worried that a lot of the contracts to remove debris would just, outsourced to, some company wherever. They're trying to, there was some concern there. So that's the initial Gazebo Gazette. Okay. Now, the city is starting over. And when you think about this, back in the day when we moved west as a country, back in the mid-1800s with the big moves, you'd show up somewhere and a town would be created around a mine or whatever it was that brought the people there. And then a newspaper would form there because people needed to know what was going on. It was just a natural part of the process. It wasn't, people did make money on it, but that's not why it was formed. It formed out of a need, And so it was called the Frontier Press. And I think what happened here is a lot like that. Frontier Press's characteristics strikingly similar to the Gazette, including the newspaper maintains continuity between old lives and new. Believe me, it was a whole new world. And, you're thrown into something you just never imagined. And so, just like when they moved west, thrown into things that you don't have the conveniences that you had before. It's just a whole different life. How can we bridge those? Word-of-mouth communications, we talked about the food tent and so forth. So now we could see it in the newspaper, and they were vetting it. So if it was in the newspaper, that was probably the truth, because you'd hear all kinds of rumors about all kinds of things. Promotes the community with a view towards growth. This boosterism, trying to boost morale by, you have to talk about the bad things, but you also have to emphasize the progress, okay, the good things. That's what they did out west. Again, it's a hard life out there. So just like it was a hard life in Post-Katrina. And gives businesses a means to reach customers through advertising. Initially, they didn't do much with that, with the newspaper, but fairly quickly, as a business or two opened up, they wanted you to know that, and the newspaper became a good vehicle for that. City of Post-Katrina essentially was starting over. Virtually no building in the downtown was usable, and the Gazette filled the city's needs very similarly to what newspapers did for those cities forming out west 150 years before. All right. Now we got kind of a transition and jumping a little bit ahead just to tell you where where things are today. After many years of running the newspaper, Schmuckler's life started to change. She got married, and she had a child. That combined with a new professional opportunity, as well as the paper needing to move to its next phase, prompted her to look for someone to take over the paper in 2013. Now, she really felt like the city was at a point at that time where it needed something beyond boosterism. It did need somebody to scrutinize, where are these grants going? Where, be more of a watchdog. Whereas in the start of this, it wasn't about being a watchdog, it was about survival. It's about making sure people knew how they could come back here. But it was at a point now, okay, it's got to go to this next phase. And she couldn't see the newspaper doing that, despite being a very accomplished journalist. She said, that wasn't what the paper was for her. And so she decided it's time to move on. Well, this isn't her last issue, but it's close. I think her last issue was in May, but you can see it ended up colorful and a lot more sophisticated than the original issue of that. Okay, so she sold the newspaper in May of 2013 to Jace Ponder, son of the editor and publisher of the Seacoast Echo in nearby Bay St. Louis. I think she felt had a good background in journalism, and family had background, so I think she felt like with his leadership it had a good chance to survive and flourish and get to the next level. Because it was near and dear to her heart. When you create something, with volunteers, but she created it, you want it to flourish. You want it to continue to survive. Jace is here, I think. Where's Jace? There's Jace right there. So he got the paper and kept it rolling for a number of years. And then Hunter Dawkins bought the paper. And this is a quote from some of the accomplishments. Under leadership, the paper has earned over 75 awards, including the National Newspaper Association Metro Idea Award in 2020, numerous Press Association accolades, and so forth. So it's still operating. 20 years later, it's still operating. Now, in those 20 years, a lot of newspapers have gone out of business all over the country. All over the country. So it's still serving a purpose, enough so that it's earned its keep. In terms of, we don't know how long it'll go on. Nothing goes forever, So, but it is still there. All right. Gazebo Gazette's creation in January 2006, critical to the residents being able to make informed and educated decisions. For those who decided to stay in Pass-Christian, the Gazette made the day-to-day drudgery of living just a little bit easier. The Gazette, because it was only targeting Pass-Christian, could give up-to-date information about business reopenings, action of every school board meeting, and every action of every school board and alderman meeting, list services, keep up with where you can get food and all of those sorts of things. Minute details that only people who lived there really needed to know, but they really needed to know. So it was a godsend. It was really very valuable, very valuable. Now the book, take a look at this. Whoops. Sorry about that. Whoops. Let me go backwards. I don't even know backspace. All right, so we've got the calm before the storm. Again, the struggle to survive is chapter 2. Then you've got the newspaper comes, because again, you've got this void from the end of August until the newspaper. You have, again, the newsletter occasionally by the AmeriCorps, but there's a void. So the newspaper is born, and then you got progress. You got all of these things that happened in the community and didn't happen. Plans, plans are plans. You have benchmarks where you go, oh, wow, okay, the city's coming back. Certain things that happened that residents would say, okay, geez, nice to have that now. So those benchmarks are pretty important. And then you have that Gazette making that transition. They do that through the Gazette being sold. And then I do a little bit about Post-Katrina today. The first chapter, by the way, I go through a bunch of individuals that were in Post-Katrina or become immediately associated with Post-Katrina. And I tell you what they were doing the day that Katrina hit. And then throughout the book, you learn, okay, what are they doing now? For instance, there's a woman who's a well-known producer in Hollywood who had been brought up in Post-Katrina part of the time. And she was in Hollywood at the time and came to the coast and saw the house that she was brought up in about to be demolished. And she bought it and ended up rebuilding that, and it is there today. So there's all these stories. You know, you have all the negative stories, but you have to have the positive stories that come out of a storm. And so there are some positive stories, and I do mention some of those positive stories. And finally, again, you just saw this. This is there's Helen and Nelson Lang, who I told you I showed the steps there, but that's the memorial for those in Post-Katrina who passed away. And it's very sad because you have multiple family members and different ones, and some, they had no means to leave. Others made a bad choice. Those things happen. All right, I think that's where I'll stop. Told to go about 40 minutes.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we have plenty of time for questions.
I was just wondering, what was the main purpose of this venture to produce the paper? Was it to make profits, to make money as a business, or just to circulate information so that the community can get information about what's happening? Or was it the purpose was to make profits, money?
No, it was strictly so that the community members who wanted to come back, or maybe even potential new members, would have the information they needed to make intelligent decisions. So it had nothing to do with profit. First, it was free, and there weren't even any ads or anything. So it was just to get the word out, so we knew what was going on in Post-Katrina. Thank you.
Of the 6,900 who were there before Katrina, how many of those have actually returned? I know you said the population is back close to, but...
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that because I know I had a neighbor who rebuilt his house, and then I saw a moving van there a little while, after that. So this is by late 2006, because we get into our house in March, and we were early. So late 2006, and they're moving there. I said, "What's going on?" She says, "I'm not going through another hurricane. I drove north until I didn't see one stick broken from Katrina, and I bought a piece of land." And you know where that was? Tennessee. Went all the way to Tennessee. And he said, "Okay, Katrina didn't damage anything here. I'm going to build a house." And that's what he did. Anyway.
Is the Gazebo Gazette still a print newspaper today, or has it gone online? I mean, I know I was from Bay St. Louis. I know Seacoast Echo no longer publishes, but Ellis Anderson founded something that was exclusively online. Has Post-Katrina kind of taken that direction, or is it still trying to be a paper?
It's still a paper, but it's also online. And I was going to at one point try to get us to that. I don't think we're going to be able to do that here. Yeah, you can, if you go oh wait, maybe it will. Oh, that's not coming up here. Okay. Yeah, if you go thegazebogazette.com, you'll see it's pretty good website, but they are still printing. They are still printing. Yes.
Dr. Strout, I just wanted to clarify that the Seacoast Echo does still exist in print and online in Bay St. Louis.
Okay.
I'm with the Press Association.
Okay.
Hi, I'm wondering, when you go through a disaster like that, what goes into the decision to rebuild or to move? Because many people think, that area is at risk, so why would you stay?
That's a really good question. Sometimes I wonder why we stayed. But you look at the pluses and minuses. In our case, my wife worked for the Gulfport School District in information technology, so her job survived. In fact, matter of fact, it was more important after the storm to rebuild the district technology. And then my job survived too. So it's like, okay, so our jobs are here. We've got a home that's, we got a gut to rebuild. We've got insurance. We like the pass. We'll stay. But as I mentioned, a neighbor of mine, he didn't want to go through that again. So very individual, weighing the pluses and minuses. Tough decision for a lot of people. Very difficult.
What did your insurance rates go up to after this? It seemed like it's almost.
You had to go to a downer.
Did it triple? Did it double?
Yeah. It wasn't good. Basically, State Farm's gone. That's who we had. Now, the thing was.
You can't get private insurance anymore?
Say that again?
You can't get private insurance anymore?
Not from State Farm in that part of the coast. They are not. If you're north of I-10, I think they're still writing policies. So we had to get an insurance broker to find an insurance company. And the sad part of it is we didn't collect from State Farm. Ours was all flood. So it's the federal flood insurance. So State Farm didn't pay a dime to us. And yet they eventually bailed out of the state. They lifted our rates way up, and then they decided to leave. So it's been rough. The flood insurance saved us. We had to have it for the mortgage, thank goodness, and that's how we rebuilt.
Larry, we've got a question from our live stream that's asking, kind of off of Mr. Daniel's question earlier, as we think about news outlets and media in terms of providing information, and then also the business aspect of it. It seems the Gazebo Gazette came very intentionally out of this idea to provide information. What could you share with us as we think about news and media today and that desire to provide accurate information, not necessarily just as a business economic model to provide revenue through advertising?
That model isn't there. Yeah, I'm glad that I worked in broadcasting back a long time ago. Glad I don't today because it's a mess, I think. I think almost we used to have some parts of the media that tried to be fair. They go out of their way to try to balance things. We don't have much of that now. So it's hard to trust anything. Really difficult. So, and they're out there to make money, and they've got social media too that they're trying to make money off of. I don't know how long. I think you still get pretty good news from the local news outlets, television or newspaper, but boy, the national news outlets, they're all dedicated to what their ideology is. So it's a little difficult to trust anything they say.
This may be beyond your exactly what you were concentrating on. I wasn't here at the very beginning, but I wonder, in the process of writing this book, did you discover that there were pockets or groups of people that fell between the cracks that you began to be more aware of in the process of writing? And I guess a second part of that question is, what about the language issues on the coast? I don't know the demographic exactly for that part of the coast, but say the Vietnamese or the Latinos.
In Pas-Christian at that time, we didn't have a lot of that type of the population. So that the language really, I don't think, was a problem. As far as people falling through the cracks, you heard all kinds of stories of the workers coming in to help rebuild these houses. And again, they're immigrants. Some I think were legal and some were illegal. That's just the way it was. Living in horrific conditions, you know. And I think that fell through the cracks. I don't think that got reported on like it should have. You know, they're rebuilding our houses, and boy, they're living in these terrible conditions. So I think that would be an example. I hadn't thought of it. I'm glad you asked the question, but that definitely was not reported on, you know.
Larry, another question from our live stream asked, obviously so much of national media immediately following Katrina focused on New Orleans and what happens there that often meant that Mississippi's story was neglected a lot. Were there any things that you found as you were looking into the Gazebo Gazette story of how they were able to locally on the ground highlight what was happening in Mississippi and not only provide that information to the local residents in Pas-Christian, but also to national media outlets?
I want to say, and maybe if Evelina was here, she would correct me, but they were so focused on Pas-Christian and getting the things that needed to be, and it was hard to live in Pas-Christian. You know, the water wasn't turned back on for months, you know, and electricity. And so I don't think, it wasn't until after the fact that we looked and saw that, oh, wow, they just ignored us. And the national media was all about, because we're trying to survive. When you're trying to survive, you dig in. And you just don't have time to worry about what other people are doing. So I don't think I don't think anything related to the national was a problem until after it all settled in, and we look back and say, wow, there was the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and they didn't really do very well with that.
We've got one more question from the live stream if we don't have another one in the room, but Sarah Campbell asked us, what challenges did the first journalists face with some of the local officials as they struggling within their roles, and how did public information flow?
I think they're talking about journalists not from here coming in to report. Is that what the question's about?
I think some of those, the first operator of the Gazebo Gazette, I think is what they're referring to, as she was collecting stories, running into working with officials who were struggling in their role, both being a witness as well as, working.
Well, luckily, because she was a volunteer that wasn't doing any of that, but was reaching out and getting connections, they had a trust in her, so that she had earned, by being a volunteer. So that's what really helped her. And the original version of the paper was the aldermen were involved. You saw in the naming of it. So, and she wasn't trying to be a watchdog, and they knew that. She was trying to help them and help homeowners rebuild. So I think there was just a trust that built there very quickly.
Back to the insurance concerns. I heard recently that the one thing that Mississippi is number one in is storms, tornadoes, And so if that's true for the whole state, then would you have interest in looking at insurance coverage and how people over the whole state would be looking at it in terms of property?
I think that is ongoing by some of the news organizations, but I think it would be a worthy project to look and see in the Tornado Alley part of the state. You know, are there a bunch of companies that have pulled out, like they pulled out of the coast after the hurricane, and put a statewide perspective on the insurance thing. I think it's a good project. I'm retiring August 15th, so I won't be looking at it, but good topic though.
Dr. Strout, Long Beach is next door. Long Beach is next door.
Yes.
Was there a similar local news source, or were they covered by the Gazebo Gazette or by the Sun Herald?
Sun Herald. Yeah, they did not. They were not as fortunate as we were. Yeah, the Sun Herald. They never got a newspaper.
I was just wondering where the Gazebo Gazette was housed in the early days, how they got funding, and how on earth they managed to print without electricity.
Early on, the printing was done by Evelina in Atlanta, because she went back to Atlanta and said, okay, we've got to be able to print this. So they would communicate, and she'd write the stories and all this stuff and then ship it back. Somebody, a volunteer. They did that for a while. I don't know how long, but there weren't any printing presses. So that's kind of what they had to do. And originally it was just done with a copier, machine. Then as they got more sophisticated, then you got the newsprint and so forth. But that's a good question. It was Atlanta. That's where they did it.
You've spoken a lot about the importance of FEMA and NOAA and the National Weather Service. All of those are entities that are being curtailed at this point. How much concern is there on the coast and in the past specifically about what would happen if this occurs again without the information and support of those entities?
I think as hurricane season, hits its stride, there are going to be more and more people concerned. I don't feel the concern related to predicting, because there are a lot of people beyond NOAA that are meteorologists that are very good and so forth. But the problem is the after the storm. Then they worry about that. Will we get a response? What will happen? And but that concern will grow when the next storm is in the Gulf. I mean, that's how far sometimes we don't think that far ahead. It's interesting. Yeah.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to just about the top of another hour here at History is Lunch. Let's give Dr. Larry Strout another round of applause.
Thank you for coming.
Just a reminder, we hope that you guys will join us this Sunday for Sunday screening, our Mississippi History Day Student Showcase, and then join us again next week, May 21st, for Mr. MacArthur Cotton and his latest work, Mississippi's Black Cotton. Again, let's give Dr. Strout a round of applause. Thank you guys for being here. Also, before I forget, we have copies of Dr. Strout's book for sale, and he will be happy to sign them if you would like one.